Welcome to a morning that began with thunder, but not from the sky. The kind of sound that reshaped the battlefield, born not from chaos, but from precision. They called it the 200 mm, a weapon so vast, so mathematically perfect it turned steel into ritual and recoil into rhythm. This was the moment when engineering crossed the line and created something almost alive. June 14, 1942. Eastern Front, near Kharkov. The air is thick with fuel and frost, the horizon trembling in gray light. Engines hot. Breath hangs low in the morning fog. The ground groans as the crew braces behind the mortar, each movement measured like a heartbeat. Smoke in lungs, steel vibrates, one order cuts through the noise. Load. Fire. The shell leaves the barrel in a flash that blinds more than it illuminates. For a fraction of a second, silence. Then the world folds in on itself. Dust lifts. Timber splinters. The shockwave travels faster than thought. They built this weapon from blueprints, from pressure charts, from theory, but out here it is something else entirely. A machine that listens only to its own logic. From the ridgeline, thunder rolls again. The men do not cheer. They calculate. They trust the machine more than their own pulse. Beneath them, the soil remembers every impact that came before. They thought artillery was brute force until this. The 200 mm was not a weapon. It was a living proof that design could become destruction. Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact minute you're listening to this echo of history. Because what you're hearing was once real. Smoke in lungs, steel vibrates, one order cuts through the noise. This is how artillery engineering turned the 220mm mortar into a machine of destruction. The 200 mortar did not appear overnight. It was the child of necessity, a response to the geometry of trench lines that refused to yield. By late 1941, the Eastern Front had become a world of distances measured not in miles but in meters of mud. Infantry advance had stalled, tanks bogged down, and artillery, once the distant arm of war, was forced to come closer. The engineers who designed the 220mm were not soldiers. They were mathematicians and machinists, men of equations and endurance. In an office north of Leningrad, draftsmen drew lines that would one day dictate where men would live and die. They calculated pressure differentials, recoil forces, and heat stress on forged steel, until one of them, a quiet major named Anton Kravchenko, noted that if we increase the chamber tolerance by 4.6 millimeters, the entire frame can survive double the load. The note was initialed in pencil, dated October 3, 1941. It was a small line, but it changed everything. From that tolerance adjustment came a weapon unlike any before it. Each 220mm mortar weighed more than 12 tons, required a crew of 12 men, and could send a 100-kilogram shell almost 9 kilometers. The loading arm was hydraulic, the recoil system redesigned to absorb rather than resist the blast. In theory, it could fire one round every 4 minutes. In practice, the rhythm depended on breath, courage, and survival. Training was relentless. Recruits learned not only how to aim, but how to listen to the rhythm of the recoil piston, to the hiss of the hydraulic bleed, to the way metal spoke when the barrel was near failure. Each man could tell by ear when the weapon was safe to load again. One error, and the gun itself would consume them. The manuals were written in cold language. Operate under temperature not exceeding 350 degrees Celsius. Observe pressure variance below 4%. But the soldiers gave it a different vocabulary. The beast, the judge, the mother. They believed it had moods, that it responded to respect and rhythm. By the spring of 1942, the first operational batteries had been deployed near Kharkov. Supplies were scarce, shells transported on open rail cars under snow and bombardment. But logistics officers learned that a single train of mortars could reverse an entire offensive. A battery of 4 guns could halt a division for hours, sometimes days. They believed the enemy was stronger, one report wrote, but timing and logistics flipped the map. In post-action logs, commanders noted a strange phenomenon. Units equipped with 200 mortars showed not just higher kill ratios, but lower desertion rates. Men trusted the machine. They called it faith in steel. The weapon became an anchor, immovable, deafening absolute. There were failures too. During one training exercise outside Kursk, a misfire tore open the recoil chamber, killing 2 men instantly. The surviving crew filed a mechanical report instead of a eulogy. Pressure leak due to incomplete lock ring rotation, it read. Corrective measure tighten sequence before ignition. It was this blend grief processed through calculation that defined the new artillery age. The 200mm was more than engineering. It was discipline embodied. Its crews operated like a single organism, bound not by ideology, but by procedure. To serve on one was to surrender individuality to become part of the cycle, fire, recoil, repair, repeat. The louder the weapon grew, the quieter its men became. Behind the front, new models were already being drafted: lighter frames, faster breech locks, variable fuses. But none would capture the same mixture of terror and admiration. The 200mm stood as proof that human precision could reach divine levels, and that in doing so it could also erase the line between control and chaos. By the time the Kharkov campaign began, the weapon's legend had already spread through both armies. Enemy soldiers reported the howling mortars that spoke in patterns. Intelligence units tried to decode the firing rhythm, believing it was a coded signal. It wasn't. It was simply math-mechanical perfection, repeating itself through smoke and distance. This was how the engineers of the 200mm turned formula into force, and how force turned back into faith. They learned the weapon the hard way, in the cold arithmetic of failure. Field trials began as experiments and ended as lessons written in metal and blood. The manual promised a cadence 1 round every 4 minutes under ideal conditions, but paper never met snow, mud, or a screaming messenger. In the first month of trials, the loss rate was recorded at 4.2%. Not all men, not all machinery, but a composite of minor and fatal mishaps, cracked barrels and burned wiring that together taught engineers what equations could not. Training was surgical. Recruits arrived with rifle drills and marching steps. They left knowing hydraulic bleed rates and the feel of a barrel on the verge of fracture. Instruction began with anatomy: the cradle, the recoil piston, the chamber tolerance, the breech lock, and firing pin. Then came rhythm, the quiet language of sequence, secure, prime, align, fire, cool. Crews were timed to the second. The fastest teams reached a cycle that matched the manuals the slowest learned to survive. Discipline was not ceremonial, it was mechanical necessity. One omitted wrench turn, one skipped valve check, and the entire battery turned on itself. Familiarization meant listening. Trainers taught recruits to identify anomalies by sound, a hitch. In the recoil was different from a pre-ignition ring. A metallic shriek in the barrel meant thermal stress, a soft sigh at the hydraulic pump meant air in the line. Men were taught to map these noises to outcomes. They marked the most dangerous failures in shorthand. On the workshop walls, lock. Ring 02, 17, venting, 03, 40, rifling crack, 05, 12. Those marks were not graffiti, they were survival. Logistics rewrote tactics. A battery's effectiveness was less about theoretical rate of fire and more about sustainable output. Field reports settled on a working figure. An operational battery could maintain roughly 180 effective rounds per day. In sustained conditions, about 45 rounds per gun per day, when ammunition, crew fatigue, and maintenance were accounted for. That number shaped orders, convoy schedules, and the cadence of assaults. Commanders planned not for an ideal barrage, but for a sequence of deliverable strikes, then spaced them to protect crews and preserve barrels. Fuel and movement mattered as much as metallurgy. The mortar's hydraulic systems and the trains that hauled it required constant feed. Records show a single mortar battery's support train consuming near 120 gallons of fuel per day under forward conditions, fuel for tractors, generators, and the heaters that kept mechanisms from freezing. Fuel shortages did not merely slow the gun, they turned it into a monument, immobile, vulnerable, and suddenly a target rather than an asset. The crew learned to ration, to prioritize generators over heaters in mild weather, to cannibalize pump oil from other units when supply lines thinned. Those improvisations saved operations, and sometimes lives. Maintenance was ritualized into the duty roster. After-action reports were pages of small corrections. A torque value increased by 2 Newton meters, here. A modified seal, there a lubrication window added to prevent microfractures. Every corrective measure carried a name and a date. When a barrel warped during a prolonged firing run, the log did not call it tragedy. It recorded the temperature curve, the time between shots, the fuel grade used, and the replacement part number. The human cost was recorded too, a medic's note, a single line, 2 men shrapnel, 1140. But the dominant language remained technical. Grief was processed into revision. Trust grew out of repetition. Crews that had watched a mortar cough and die and then brought it back to life trusted each other more than they trusted maps or forecasts. They developed shorthand commands that cut seconds off the cycle and reduced error, a 2-syllable cue that meant vent, now a hand signal, that meant barrel temperature, critical. That trust was quantifiable in records. Units equipped with properly trained 220mm crews reported steadier rates of fire and fewer catastrophic failures, a practical economy measured in hours of downtime avoided. There were ethical echoes in the drills. Engineers noted privately that improving survivability made the instrument more lethal. Making the recoil system absorb more energy meant the crew stayed alive to fire again. Improving chamber tolerances increased accuracy and destruction per round. Each technical gain translated directly into casualties on the other side, and a different kind of burden on the men who operated the machinery. They learned to reconcile. They learned to be technicians of violence, precise, exhausted, and methodical. By the time the batteries were declared combat-ready, the training regimen had hardened into doctrine. Lessons from misfires and burned seals became checklists, and checklists became the new ritual. The weapon demanded faith not in ideology, but in procedure. If the manuals were scripture, the crew were its priests. They tended the instrument, recited its rules, and in the cold calculus of war, they kept it working. Failures had taught them to listen. Lessons had taught them to obey. Discipline had taught them to survive. And beneath all of it, the machine waited, patient, unforgiving, ready to translate human precision into sudden, absolute force. June 15th, July 2nd, 1942. Kharkov sector and peripheral ridgelines. The first batteries moved into position under a sky that held weather and warning in equal measure. Maps issued at headquarters were thin with certainty. Orders were thicker with contingency. The mortar crews came in the dark, inching on sleds and low-slung tractors, the great tubes wrapped in canvas like industrial sarcophagi. Each emplacement meant compromise, a balancing of concealment, an arc of supply routes, and line of sight for observers. The terrain decided many things before men and machines could. Soft loam swallowed tracks. Frozen ruts preserved them. Woods provided cover, and at the same time obstacles for the hydraulic cranes that wrestled the tubes into place. Everything that followed would be shaped by that first week of placement, by the angles chosen and the small decisions to tilt a cradle a degree to the left or the right. Contact began not as a battle, but as an experiment of will. Forward observers climbed knolls and barns and church steeples when they could. When they could not, they trusted aerial correction. The mortar was not an isolated instrument. It lived inside a network, telephone lines strung between dugouts, runners with muddy boots, wireless sets that blinked in static like nervous eyelids. Radio calls were short, formulaic, stripped of color to reduce confusion. Grid reference bearing elevation correction. The language of fire control reduced vast human movement to precise coordinates. Grid 4123 bearing 162 elevation, 42 correction, 10 left. The crew responded with mechanics rather than rhetoric. The firing sequence became ritual, but it was ritual braided to command and observation. The first day of sustained operations demonstrated what intelligence had only suggested. Where light artillery smeared the ground in area suppression, the 200mm cut into structure. A factory facade collapsed in measured stages. A bunker's roof came apart in a way that made the term obliteration seem clinical and inadequate. The shell's mass and the muzzle energy translated into a pressure the defenders had not expected. Steel and concrete thought, impervious, fractured along lines the engineers had forecast in their drawings. In reports filed that night, a company commander wrote plainly, "Structural failure at point of impact exceeded predicted values by 13%. The number was circled in the margin not for drama, but for analysis. Radio discipline proved as crucial as mechanical discipline. One misrouted call could mean wasted rounds. One delayed correction could mean a missed depression and a lost opportunity. In the second week, a forward observer misread wind shear, and the next salvo fell short by 120 meters 102-120. The log would later record it in plain numerals. The correction was immediate. The crew adjusted elevation compensated for temperature, and the following rounds landed within 5 meters of the intended structure. That precision 5 meters over a range of 7,000 meters was not luck. It was the sum of training instrumentation and repetition. Sustained firing exposed a cadence of vulnerability. Barrels heated, seals swelled, bolts loosened. In one 24-hour window, a single battery cycled through 210 rounds 210, slightly above the sustained doctrine discussed at command, because of an urgent need to pin a counterattack. The record shows that at round 187, the barrel developed a hairline fissure that would later require replacement. The crew had been forced to run beyond the conservative thresholds engineers had advised, and the machine had answered with failure. The damage report was factual. Fatigue fracture, initiated at rifling channel propagation, observed at plus 23 hours of sustained firing beyond recommended cycle. The report reads like a ledger of cause and effect. It is what soldiers used to make sense of loss. Contact was physical in ways reports cannot fully translate. Men who served at the tubes recounted in brief formal debriefs the shock of recoil transferring through earth and boot, the smell of burned primer and scorched grease. They recorded the change in tempo when supply trains arrived late. They documented the increase in misfire risk when the crew had logged more than 18 hours on duty without proper maintenance breaks. The official rosters noted the human costs, a loss rate of 4.2%, during initial trials had been refined into operational expectations. The front batteries saw non-recoverable mechanical incidents at approximately 1.3% per month, under sustained fire conditions, while personnel casualties varied with exposure and counter-battery activity. Those percentages are shorthand for a calculus the men felt as rhythm. More fire meant higher odds that a barrel would fracture or that a counter-battery salvo would find a crew during emplacement. Counter-battery warfare emerged as an arithmetic of detection and deception. Opposing forces learned to listen. Sound-ranging teams and radar-like acoustic arrays attempted to triangulate the new guns, and when they succeeded, they called in their own responses: light guns for suppression, medium for harassment, and occasionally the massed indirect fire that could make a battery inactive in hours. The 200mm units adapted. They adopted camouflage nets and decoy emplacements, false tubes made from timber and canvas painted in the correct hues, and they practiced displacement drills that read like choreography: fire, collapse the site, roll the barrel onto a flat car, and be 3 kilometers away before dusk. Mobility was not ideal. The mortar moved slowly, but well-rehearsed crews accomplished displacement in a matter of hours, often outpacing enemy observation by exploiting fog and darkness. Terrain again shaped outcomes in counterintuitive ways. In open steppe, the space allowed observers far to the rear. In broken woods, the canopy muffled sound and hid smoke. Villages with narrow lanes and stone walls amplified blast differently than open fields. When a shell struck a narrow lane, it shuddered through masonry and turned 2-story houses into skeletons of beams. Radio calls adjusted. The calculation of collateral shock changed. Commanders issued orders to favor certain target sets when populated areas were within the expected blast radius. The mortar's destructive radius, the effective lethal envelope, extended beyond immediate structural collapse. Debris, secondary fires, and roof collapses created a cascade of damage measured by reports of displacement and refugee movement. In one district, civic records later indicated that 3 villages were depopulated within a week of focused mortar strikes. That displacement recorded in municipal ledgers is an indirect metric of the weapon's social effect. Communication technology evolved in the crucible. Field telephones ran like capillaries. Wireless sets functioned as arteries. Creators of the fire control system iterated quickly. An improved predictive table arrived by courier to one battery, its pages filled with compensations for barometric pressure and propellant variance. The crew tested the new table under fire. The subsequent accuracy improved to a margin of error within 3 meters for stationary targets. That improvement transformed planning. Commanders could now order precision strikes intended to disable locomotives, break bridges, and collapse ammunition dumps rather than simply saturate an area. The mortar became a tool for surgical infrastructure denial, a shift that turned logistics into a target as much as troops were. Logistics in turn dictated operational tempo. Ammunition trains were a lifeblood. Without them, the mortar was an immobile leviathan. In the Kharkov sector, resupply could be precarious. Enemy interdiction of rail and road corridors forced planners to ration intensive barrages and to cache shells closer to the guns in anticipation of arrival windows. When convoys were on schedule, a battery could sustain roughly 180 effective rounds per day, 180 distributed among 4 guns. When convoys were interrupted, commanders had to choose expend firepower now to influence immediate battle conditions or conserve for a later possibly decisive barrage. That choice was never purely tactical. It weighed risk to morale, to the crews, and to the strategic picture. Fuel consumption was practical and precise. Tractors that dragged the emplacements, generators that powered hydraulic pumps and electric priming, and the heaters that kept hydraulic lines fluid in sub-zero temperatures, all demanded fuel. Operational logs recorded consumption at near 120 gallons per battery per day when operating at forward positions and maintaining readiness. 120 gallons a figure that included vehicle diesel and fuel for small generators. When fuel lines were cut, the mortar's utility contracted. Crews preserved fuel by lowering generator duty cycles, by shifting to manual priming where possible, and by reducing firing cadence. Fuel shortfalls produced a rigid reality. The weapon, for all its destructive capacity, was dependent on a chain of mundane consumables. Radio calls too changed as the battle matured. Opposing units attempted to jam to mimic to create false corrections and fake coordinates. The response from crews was procedural encrypted call signs, time-limited bursts, and code words replaced plain speech. The procedural discipline that had been drilled in training transferred to communication, brevity, accuracy, redundancy. Lines were double-checked. Where possible, observers used prearranged timings. At 0700, observe grid 4021. At 0703, apply pattern A. These timed patterns reduced the risk of misinterpretation under stress. Casualties were catalogued with an economy of terms. When a battery came under direct counter-battery fire, reports listed instrument status, first crew status, second, and then tactical options. A typical entry might read, Enemy CB concentrated on emplacement alpha. Instrument status breach, OK barrel temp high. Crew 1 KIA 2 WIA. Action displace 0300 HORs. That procedural ordering reflected priorities. The gun was an asset to be salvaged, and once viable, it could be redeployed to reassert control of a sector. The human toll sat behind the numbers. It showed up in late-night letters in the cramped script of logbooks where a line would be added, a private Sokolov letter to mother found in kit. The archive keeps both technical and human traces, and the juxtaposition is never neutral. The swing of outcomes in the field was measurable. In engagements where the 220mm batteries were used to deny movement across open corridors, opposing unit advances were delayed a mean of 24 hours per concentrated barrage, 24 hours enough time for friendly infantry to reorient or for reserves to arrive. In assaults where the mortar targeted fortified positions, casualty distribution changed. Defenders suffered higher structural losses. Logistics units were disrupted, and the psychological effect of a weapon that could collapse stone altered decision calculus at brigade level. Commanders began to write doctrine that integrated heavy mortars into combined arms operations rather than treating them as an adjunct to artillery. Yet the mortar was not omnipotent. It had predictable weaknesses, slow traverse for rapidly moving targets, vulnerability during emplacement and displacement, and dependency on supply. When the enemy combined rapid armor movement with obscuring smoke and feint attacks, batteries had to adapt by pre-sighting probable approach corridors and by maintaining mobile deception. The dance of adaptation, continued tactics that worked one week, failed the next, and the logbooks filled with a steady stream of revision notes. In the end, Combat Phase 1 was a lesson in systems, a lesson that extended from metallurgy through manpower to maps and schedules. The 220mm mortar changed the shape of engagements, not because it replaced other arms, but because it imposed a new logic on operations that destruction could be engineered, timed, and integrated as a precise instrument of denial. Where infantry once relied on chance and courage, they now relied on a machine whose math could be trusted, provided the chain that sustained it remained unbroken. And so the first phase closed, not with a single decisive moment, but with a series of adjustments, crews learning to displace faster by 2 hours on average. Commanders reworking supply timetables to ensure ammunition trains arrived within 24-hour windows. Engineers noting thermal gradients that would inform the next update to chamber design. Each change was small, precise, and consequential, the same qualities that had made the mortar effective in the first place. June 28, 1942. Kharkov forward line. The choice arrived in a second that stretched like elastic. A tracer blinked past, a forward observer. Static choked the wireless, and a commander weighed 2 outcomes on a palm-sized map. The enemy's resupply column was due at 14:30, train manifests, and intercepted messages agreed, and a rail bridge 3 kilometers beyond the factory cluster represented a choke point. Fire now and risk barrel fatigue and prompt counter-battery response. Wait, and the convoy might pass unmolested. The order came clipped without flourish, Alpha. Prepare immediate pattern, Bravo execute on my mark. The crew moved as if rehearsed by the instrument itself. Their actions were not rhetoric, but calibrated motion, secure prime aligned fire. The mortar answered like a heart obeying a surgeon's hand. The first shell struck at 14:31 and tore a support joint. The second punched through the open rail bed and detonated fuel in a supply car. By 14:34, a locomotive burned and the enemy column stalled. Tactical reports recorded the result in tidy numerals: 1. Locomotive destroyed 2 supply cars, incinerated a logistical delay of 24 hours, yet the ledger could not encompass the immediate human echo. Counter-battery detection was rapid. Sound-ranging teams triangulated the blast pattern. Enemy guns registered bearing and returned fire within minutes. The emplacement's perimeter became a grid of incoming arcs, and the battery shifted from hunter to hunted. The first impacts were near misses that spoke of intent rather than accident. Shrapnel tore earth beside the recoil bed. The shockwave set tools clattering in their boxes. Private Mikhail Sokolov was struck as he crawled to the recoil hitch. His cry was brief, the sort of sound that cuts a clean line through atmosphere and attention. He fell beneath a canvas, the fabric stained with soil, and a sharper color, and in that crouched violence the crew performed the practices that had been rehearsed 1,000 times: render first aid secure, the instrument record status. They signed the log before they spoke of fear. The repair entry is clinical and exact: 28-06-42-15-02. Emplacement Alpha. Action immediate fire on rail bridge. Enemy CB within 6 mins. Instrument breach intact. Barrel temp elevated. Recoil piston edge deformation at seam B12. Hydraulic bleed valve compromised. Casualties: 1 KIA Parvat M Sokolov 2 WIA. Corrective emergency bleed valve replacement. Impose cooldown cycle. Displace 1800 HURs. Recommend barrel inspection/replacement at depot. The language is sparse because precision is what the machine demands, and because facts are how men make sense of arbitrariness. In the quiet that followed the barrage and the shock, a folded letter slid from Sokolov's tunic into the dirt where a sergeant found it and tucked it into his breast pocket. The handwriting was small and practical. Dear Mama, if the letter finds you, know that the gun sang as we planned. Do not blame maps or men. I think of the garden in Zhytomyr when I feel fear. Feed the cat if I do not return. It is a domestic fragment among metal and cordite, an ordinary life stitched into extraordinary noise. The letter traveled in archive boxes later. In cursive and in memory, it became a human annotation to the logbook's sterile numerals. The battery reacted with a choreography that blurred pain and procedure. Engineers worked with the speed of habit, replacing valves and retorquing breech locks, while medics bundled wounds, and an officer notified higher command. Discipline in those moments was not stoicism alone, but a method for survival. Act methodically, so that chance has fewer places to hide. The motif reasserted itself, smoke in lungs. Steel vibrates, one order cuts through the noise, and each cut demanded a follow-up 10 record repair move. The crew's hands moved with the mechanic's certainty. The same fingers that could index a firing pin could also tie a bandage or fold a letter. The human cost left visible and invisible marks. Sergeant Petrov returned to duty with an ugly crescent of scar where shrapnel had torn muscle. He measured recoil by how that arm flexed under load, and later requested reassignment to breach maintenance because the motion no longer felt safe in combat. Novik bore a concussion that blurred the rhythm of numbers, and his notation in personnel files reads, "Recovered, prefers workshop tasks." The scars became operational data maps of which bodies could endure what stresses and who might be better placed away from direct recoil. History keeps these annotations in personnel notes and in whispered kitchen table conversations that never entered formal reports. Tactically, the engagement hardened doctrine. Commanders learned to stagger barrages across batteries to reduce the risk of simultaneous detection, to stagger ammunition trains, and to employ decoy emplacements of timber and canvas that mimicked silhouette and smoke. When the enemy improved acoustic triangulation, the defenders countered with displacement drills, execute collapse, move, turning emplacement into a mobile choreography, even for a slow Leviathan. In one documented adaptation, displacement times improved by an average of 2 hours after retraining. In consequence, survivability rose measurably because the enemy's window for effective counter-battery response narrowed. The machine demanded human improvisation, and men delivered it. Failures multiplied under pressure. 2 nights later, an attempted night displacement coincided with compromised ammunition propellant that had absorbed moisture produced misfires. A replacement seal failed to seat correctly, allowing a pressure spike that warped a rifling channel. And a secondary counter-battery strike struck while the crew attempted a hot swap. The report distilled the incident into bureaucratic economy. 30s, 06, 42, 03, 18. Emplacement. Bravo. Misfires. X2, propellant moisture. Seal failure. Recommend enforce drying protocol. Retorque breach. Schedule barrel replacement. In human terms, the night was a span of smoke, shouted countersigns, and men working until dawn to make a gun whole again. They adjusted tarpaulin protocols, retooled storage routines, and rewrote checklists that would become doctrine. The climax of this phase was not a single heroic tableau, but a string of micro-decisions where courage and calculation braided. Each split-second choice, fire or hold repair, or displace feed another round, or preserve a barrel, was a hinge with consequences measured in hours and lives. The tactical gains from the bridge strike were undeniable. A day's delay in enemy logistics, a burned locomotive disrupted timetables. Yet for each metric of success there were margin notes of cost: a body in a tarpaulin, a scar on an arm, a letter to a mother. The archive houses both the repair log and the letter. Together they provide the full ledger of consequence. When the dust settled enough to permit a count, the battery's records summarized the calculus: immediate tactical advantage train destroyed, supply delayed 24 hours, operational impact increase in enemy caution on that corridor, human toll. KIA-2 IO, multiple equipment faults requiring depot-level repairs. The men filed those summaries as routine entries. Their margins, however, collected the small human acts that formal reports could not: a shared cigarette, between shifts, the folding of a letter into a pocket, the quiet humming of a man who had seen a comrade fall. The machine had translated a split-second order into decisive destruction, and in doing so had exacted a cost that would register in scar tissue, in revised checklists, and in the slow adjustments of doctrine that followed. Smoke in lungs, steel vibrates, one order cuts through the noise. The motif is not elegy, but record: a rhythm that explains how precision met contingency, how engineering met error, and how the human apparatus around the weapon adapted or paid the price. When the smoke cleared over Kharkov, silence did not arrive as peace, it arrived as arithmetic. The officers tallied what could be counted: 112 rounds expended, 11 bridges disabled, 2 trains destroyed, and 1 factory complex reduced to a husk of beams and dust. The losses were listed with equal precision: 3 barrels warped beyond repair, 2 hydraulic pistons fractured, 1 emplacement abandoned. Human numbers were added in the same ledger, but in smaller handwriting: 4 dead, 7 wounded, 3 evacuated for medical treatment. In the bureaucracy of war, the tallies sit side by side as if they belonged to the same column. Repairs began before the ground cooled. At depot level, engineers laid out the wounded instruments like patients. Barrels were measured for expansion. Cracked rings were replaced. Recoil beds were realigned within millimeter tolerances. Each repair produced a report, a quiet memorial written in torque and pressure units. The entries are dry, almost ascetic. Replace seal B12. Calibrate hydraulic pressure to 4.2 atmospheres. Restore operational status. The language is devoid of emotion, because emotion did not tighten bolts or clean the grit from threads. Yet between the lines, there is something that resembles reverence, the tone of craftsmen mending what had both protected and punished them. For the men who had served the after-action debriefs, mixed fatigue with disbelief. They spoke of luck as a tangible element of shells that landed meters wide, of fragments that curved away inexplicably, of the moment a gust of wind or a brief pause saved an entire crew. They admitted, too, that luck had limits, that it favored those who followed procedure until it became instinct. Leadership recognized this pattern and began to fold it into doctrine. Skill sustains luck. Luck rewards discipline. Reports from Kharkov became training material across the front, not for triumph, but for continuity. Commanders drew lessons in the margins. One colonel summarized the experience in a phrase that would later appear in an internal memorandum. Precision extends survival. It was not a slogan, merely a conclusion reached through attrition. Skill alone could not stop a shell, but it could reduce the number of times chance was asked to intervene. The leadership quietly reshaped how batteries operated, new rotation schedules to reduce fatigue, improved signal redundancy, to protect against jamming, tighter thresholds for barrel temperature. Doctrine was rewritten in the image of Kharkov's lessons, measured, mathematical, almost tender toward the machine that had demanded so much. Among the surviving crew, reflection came in fragments rather than speeches. Petrov kept the scar on his forearm as a personal chart of cause and effect, a reminder that he had once reached for a valve half a second too late. Others measured survival in simpler ways: the number of cigarettes smoked in the quiet between barrages, the number of days since the last letter arrived from home. These small counts formed a counter-narrative to the official tallies. They were human decimals appended to the machine's whole numbers. The workshops turned from repair to innovation. Engineers dissected damaged barrels and wrote margin notes on tolerance thresholds, experimenting with new alloys that might absorb stress differently. The 220mm mortar had begun as an emergency measure. Now it was evolving into a blueprint for post-war thinking, not as a weapon of glory, but as an instrument that revealed how design could dictate destiny. The very same hydraulic principles would later inform civilian engineering, bridge construction, dam, turbines, mining drills. The line between destruction and creation had never been thinner. In the official archives, a final line closes the Kharkov file: battery operational efficiency at conclusion of campaign 81%. Average accuracy within 5.2 meters. Below it, in pencil, a later hand added an unofficial annotation. Men diminished. Mechanism improved. It is both epitaph and evolution, a ledger that balances material progress against human erosion. Leadership learned that power, when engineered, must also be tended. That the precision which makes a machine lethal also demands humility from those who wield it. The mortar's history proved an enduring thesis. Engineering did not merely build weapons, it built systems of survival, where skill tempered luck, and where design became the last form of faith left to men in chaos. When the war ended, the 220mm mortar was not retired in ceremony. It simply faded, absorbed into manuals, diagrams, and factory blueprints that bore no names, only part numbers. Yet its logic survived. The engineers who had once drafted its chambers and pistons went on to design the next generation of self-propelled artillery, lighter, faster, more autonomous. They carried with them the same principle that had shaped the 220mm creation, that destruction could be measured, standardized, and made predictable if the math was right. The doctrine that emerged after 1945 no longer worshipped size, it worshipped control. Reports from Kharkov became required reading in staff colleges, not as glorification, but as warning. The notes on barrel fatigue and cooling intervals informed the maintenance schedules of Cold War heavy mortars and early rocket artillery. Military engineers began to speak a new dialect, one that fused human endurance with mechanical rhythm. They called it systemic fire coordination, a term that echoed the 200's legacy, even when its name was forgotten. The same engineering that once magnified destruction found reincarnation in industry. The hydraulic pistons that managed recoil inspired post-war designers of construction cranes and deep-shaft drills. Stress dispersion alloys tested under fire became the backbone of bridge spans and dam gates. Every civilian use was in some quiet way an echo of the mortar's precision. What had been built for war became a vocabulary of pressure and balance for peace. The boundary between weapon and instrument blurred not morally, but mechanically. For historians, the 220mm represents a hinge moment when human ambition met its own reflection in steel. It was the first artillery piece designed entirely around data rather than tradition, the prototype of an age where war became an engineering problem. In archives across Europe and Russia, its blueprints remain filed under obsolete. Yet technicians still study the margins, the tolerances, the flow rates, the small pencil marks that carried the logic of survival through a generation. Its cultural impact endures not through monuments, but through procedures. Modern operators still repeat phrases that were once shouted at Kharkov: brace, fire, cool, move. They may not know the origin, but the cadence carries forward a lineage of discipline dressed in utility. In museums, fragments of 200 barrels sit behind glass, oxidized and silent, while the reports that once accompanied them rest in folders stamped declassified. To the untrained eye, they are relics. To engineers, they are the fossils of process evidence of how thought became metal, and metal became doctrine. Beyond the battlefield, the lesson persisted in subtler forms. Precision is not merely the art of hitting a target. It is the responsibility of knowing what that target costs. The men who survived the 200's service years spoke of it not with pride but with wary respect, as if they had witnessed something that balanced genius and guilt on the same axis. Their children became engineers, machinists, teachers, people who still measured, still calibrated, but in quieter industries. The weapons story matters now because it mirrors the era we inhabit, an age that still believes technology can make violence clean, efficient, or justified. The 200mm reminds us that every calculation has a human remainder. Its bolts and valves may rest in archives, but its logic endures in every system that prizes accuracy over empathy, every innovation that promises mastery over uncertainty. And so the record closes where it began. Smoke in lungs, steel vibrates, one order cuts through the noise. The 220mm mortar proved that engineering could summon unimaginable power, and that the measure of progress is not what we build, but what we choose to aim it at. Subscribe for archival-based stories, evidence over sensationalism. Because history is never just what was destroyed, it's what was designed to survive.